what's going on with the dollar. There's been a lot of headlines recently associated with maybe the dollar losing a little bit of its prominence in the international sphere. And I think we need to address those so that we can kind of separate a little bit fact from fiction, and also separate a little bit, the notion of maybe reduced importance on a global stage away from collapse, because I feel like those two things tend to get conflated when in fact they should not be. So with that said, is the dollar losing its value? Folks, Rick Wedell here, Chief Investment Officer at RFG. So first and foremost, let's explain what's going on, which is there are a couple of countries out there that are looking to create a different standard for, or a different alternative to, the dollar in international trade. To give you a little bit of a historical background, up until really after the 1940s, the dollar became really the global standard for international trade. During the Cold War, there was the dollar and the ruble, and depending on whose sphere of influence you were under, you would determine what you did business with and how you traded. Post-Cold War, it really became the dollar as the emergent currency and the dominant currency on the international stage. And there are a number of countries that aren't necessarily happy with that arrangement. And when Russia invaded the Ukraine, the United States used its control of the dollar to effectively weaponize the dollar as a way to punish Russia for invading their neighbor. They basically kicked Russia out of some dollar-denominated banking systems. They made it very hard for Russia to trade internationally using the dollar. And then they also basically seized a bunch of dollars that were on deposit at foreign institutions. Seized being another word for stole, depending on which side of the border you're looking at that transaction in. And that was really when a number of countries around the world, other than the North Koreas and Irans, who have always kind of had a problem with the dollar, sat up and took notice and said, wait a minute, if the United States did this to Russia when they got crosswise with them, what would stop them from doing it to me? And so you've recently seen an initiative out of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to create sort of a global alternative currency. Three most important players, and those that I just mentioned, are Russia and China, who are certainly no friends of the United States. It seems very clear why those particular countries would want a currency in international trade that is not controlled by the United States. They have their own political agenda and aspirations. And I would say that India kind of falls within that camp as well. They're not openly hostile to the United States, or really even, we don't necessarily have a acrimonious relationship the same way that we do with China or Russia. But India has its own global aspirations. And certainly if you ask them, I think they would say, look, we don't want to be under the control of Russia, China, but we also don't want to be under the control of the United States. So having an alternative currency makes a lot of sense. And then you have, what I'll call the more politically unfriendly countries to the United States, who are all cheering this, particular development. So Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, you can kind of circle your list of, what we would consider evil dictators around the world. All of those individuals would love to have a way to trade without necessarily having it go through the US banking system. That's the who and the why. In order to understand what that likely results in, the US currently controls about 65%. 65% of all trade internationally is done in dollars, and then about 20% on top of that is done in euros. And then after that, it falls off quite precipitously. Do I think that we're going to fall off and be, never used for international trade? Of course not. Because if you're France or Germany or the United Kingdom, you don't want to trade in a currency that's controlled by Russia and China any more than they want to trade in a currency that's controlled by the United States. There are likely, similar to the Cold War, to be spheres of influence that get developed. And I'm guessing if you're a neutral country, you may want to try and trade a little bit with both parties. And that may mean that there are some subtle shifts in terms of the dollar's dominance, but it doesn't mean that the dollar is going away in international trade by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing that I would just note is that This isn't the first time that a currency has lost its status as the premier currency in international trade. Prior to about 1914, it was the British pound. That was the currency that was the dominant currency for international trade. Between 1914 and 1944, there was the ascendancy of the dollar. You really had a dollar-pound kind of international trade framework. And then with the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944, the International Monetary Fund was established, and there were a series of policies that were put in place that sort of cemented the hold of the dollar on international trade, and the dollar's been the dominant currency ever since. That does not mean, the last time I checked, that London is on fire and has been since 1944. In fact, last time I checked, the British are doing quite well, thank you, and they're not worried about, buying homes in pounds or buying groceries in pounds or owning assets that are denominated in pounds. In fact, if you look around the globe, there are several examples of currencies that are not the dominant currency for international trade, namely all of them except the dollar. And people that live in those countries, whether it's the Eurozone, whether it's Japan, whether it's any one of these other established countries, aren't necessarily worried about, oh my goodness, my currency is not used for international trade and thus it must be worthless. You can use Australia as an example. The Australian dollar is relatively strong, despite the fact that it's not used to trade for really anything. For a currency to collapse, you need to see 500, 600, 700% rates of inflation before that sort of currency collapse really happens. Whether it was Chile's currency, whether it was Argentina's currency, Zimbabwe's currency, these are all sort of recent examples of currencies that became worthless. And when I say recent, I mean within the past 60, 70 years. Currencies don't go away all that frequently. And so I just caution folks, just because we might give up some share on international trade to some countries that want to politically align themselves with Russia and China, does not mean that the value of your house needs to be converted over to Bitcoin tomorrow so that you can be safe and secure in a store of value. If anything, you can look to numerous points in history and numerous other countries where the dollar's role or your currency's role as a component of international trade doesn't necessarily impact your day-to-day life. So with that, as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or to your advisor. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.